Hey there and welcome back to another Unreal 4 shoot 'em up tutorial. So in this video we will be going through the BP enemy spawner, just so we can start fleshing out the logic behind how we'll bring the enemies in, and we can then build upon that as we go through and add the final enemy type as well. So something I wanted to show, in case people aren't aware, is a nice little trick. What I'm going to do is drag in a box trigger, because the blueprint we need pretty much has exactly these components. So rather than making an actor from scratch and then building up to this, we're going to drag in a box trigger. We will right click on this, and then we can make sure you have this selected, and we'll go over here and add blueprint script. If we select the blueprints and enemies folder, and we'll just call this the BP underscore enemy spawner. It's just a really nice simple way to create a blueprint from an object that already exists. And we now have all of the components set up as we need them. And we also have the blueprint ready for use in the world as well. So really handy in a few ways there. Okay, so the way that the spawn is going to work, if we go to the event graph, we're just going to use a timer, and we'll randomly spawn in enemies over a certain amount of time, and then every time you kill a certain amount of the easy enemies, we will then spawn in a boss enemy, and we're going to spawn in the asteroids as well at a kind of random interval. So keeping all of that in mind, off of the event begin play, first thing we need to do is get a reference to the game mode. So as we've done before, if we do a cast to BP underscore game mode, and again we want to get the game mode as the first thing here, and then we'll just make sure that we have the BP underscore game mode selected, so we'll promote that to variable, and then if that's been successful we will have our reference, and we'll just call this BP underscore game mode. Okay, so once we have that, all we want to do is kind of future proofing, is we'll use a sequence here. So we won't be using this at the moment, but when we add the logic in to call the asteroids into play as well, I know that we'll want to do this in a sequence. So for now, off of the then 0, we're just going to set timer by function name, and the name of that function, I think we'll just call this spawn enemy. And for now, we're going to do this every single second and make sure that this is looping, and we don't need an object reference here. We can remove the event begin overlap and the event tick just to make some space. And then just to be safe, actually, I'm just going to copy the spawn enemy so that we have the exact spelling down here. And then we'll add a custom event. So create your custom event and paste the name in. So that will be the spawn enemy. So this will be the function we're calling every second. So the first thing we need to do is we'll drag in our reference to the game mode. So control drag that in. And we want to check a few variables. So from here, we want to drag out the enemy count. In fact, we need to make a few variables. So if we go back and find our game mode, we haven't yet updated this, so we need these now. So we'll need a few integers first of all. So if we go and add some variables, I'm going to call the first one enemy count, and we'll just change this to the type of integer. And then the same way we've done previously, now that we have this, we can make the other integers as well. So the next one we'll call max enemies. So this will be the total number of enemies that we're going to allow on screen at any one time. We may as well create the variable to check how many enemies we've killed as well. And not quite related, but as we're making the integers, we'll make a reference or a variable for the score, and then a reference for the top score. So that's all of the integers set up. And actually, whilst we're here, if we compile this, we can leave the enemy count to 0. That's going to be updated in the blueprints, but we do want to set the max enemies. I'm going to make that 5. I think about 5 enemies on screen should be fine, especially just for testing. And you can play about with that as and when you like. So if we go back to the BP enemy spawner, off of the BP underscore game mode reference, we can now find the enemy count. So we'll get the enemy count, and we're also going to want to get the variable for the max enemies. Then quite simply, off of the spawn enemies event, we want to check a branch. And then we want to find out whether or not a certain integer is less than another integer. So int less than int. And we'll make sure that the enemy count is less than max enemies. So just a simple population control thing there. And when we have that, we're going to drag off. We'll get another branch if this is true. So it means we still have some enemies spare to spawn in. And then using our reference from the game mode, we want to get the total number of enemies killed. So we'll get the number of enemies killed. We'll do a modulo for the integer. We'll set this to a value of 5, and I'll explain, if you don't know what this is, I'll explain this a bit more, but we'll just type this out first of all, and we'll do an equals check on this, and we'll leave that to be equal to 0. And then finally off of here, we're going to do an AND Boolean check. And again, off of the enemies killed, we're going to do an isn't equal to. And I'm actually just going to promote that to a variable, and we'll call this current enemies killed. And we'll be updating this as we go through a little bit later. Okay, and that's going to be the second argument for our AND Boolean. So then we're going to plug this into that branch. So we're also going to come out now, we'll create a new custom event, and we're going to call this one spawn enemy 2. You could call this spawn boss or spawn whatever you like, but I'm just going to call this enemy 2 for simplicity. Okay, so if all of this comes back true, and I will explain what this is in just a moment, I promise, but if this comes back true, then we want to spawn enemy 2, and we're going to come off of here and add a delay. This delay will be based on a random value, so we'll do a random float in range. So we'll get our random float in range, and we'll just make this somewhere between 0.5 and 2 seconds. So 0.5 and 2. And I'll zoom back in a moment as well so we can see what's going on. And then likewise, if this is false, we're just going to skip the spawn enemy 2, and we're just going to go straight to the delay. So we'll just move this up out of the way, move this down. And then finally, once all of this has been done, we will spawn the actual actor. So spawn actor from class. And this will be our standard enemy, so BP underscore enemy, and that will be the enemy 1. Okay, so this is just doing a whole bunch of checks to find out what type of enemy we should be spawning, how many enemies are in the game, and based on this final check, we'll spawn either enemy 1, or we're going to jump to the enemy 2 function a bit later. And then just to control the location and the scale, we're going to split the structure pin here. So split the structure pin of the transform. And we'll actually be using this a bit later. We're going to make a very simple function to return a random location. But at the moment, I just want to get things spawned in, so we'll leave that at the moment. But the reason, if you don't split the structure pin, if you try and compile this, it will tell you that it doesn't have values for the transform. The spawn transform isn't correct. Whereas if we split this, this just gives us a little bit of freedom. We can now compile this, and it will just take some default values, which is perfectly fine for now. So this is really quite handy if you don't quite know, as you're prototyping and testing things, you don't know exactly how or where you're going to spawn things. Just split the structure pin, and it means you can bypass the transform for the time being at least. Okay, so we'll go back to this weird looking thing over here. So for people who are not familiar with modulus, it's quite simply all this is doing is same as if you've seen this in normal maths. It's just taking the division of two numbers, and whereas normally you'd be returned with the division amount, what the modulo will do is it will return the remainder. So what we're trying to find out is based on the number of enemies killed divided by 5, we want to find out if there's a remainder of this. So this is going to output the remainder of however many enemies we've killed divided by 5. And we just want to check that this is 0. So essentially what we're saying is every 5th enemy will be a point to spawn a boss. So 5, 10, all of these numbers will have 0 as the remainder value. And then if that is true, and also if this isn't equal to the current number of enemies that we've killed, and this is just something I found that we needed to add in because otherwise you could potentially spawn a boss at the very beginning of the game, because 0 obviously has a remainder of 0 as well. Then if both of these return true, we're going to come up to this branch, and this is the point that we will spawn our boss. So essentially every 5th enemy we're going to spawn a boss. And if that's too often, or you wanted to play about with this, then you can just simply change the value here. So change it to something like 10 or 7 or whatever you want for the frequency of the boss to be spawned. So that's what that is doing. And I think this is quite self-explanatory, but we're simply, as I said, we're just checking the current enemy count in the game mode. We're making sure that we haven't reached the maximum number of enemies that we want on the screen. And then if that's true, then we're going to do the next check. And obviously if that's false, so if we do get a remainder value in here, anything which isn't 0, then what we will do, we know we haven't quite reached the number of kills to get to a boss. So we're going to add a delay, and we'll spawn in our enemy 1. So that is the first part of this really done. And in fact, I think the enemy 2 function is so simple that what we can do is we can set this up now. So what we want to do, when you spawn the enemy 2, we want to set the current enemies killed. So this is our local variable that we're tracking for the enemies killed. And what that will be is we'll control drag in the BP underscore game mode, and we want to get the number of enemies killed. So we'll get the enemies killed, we'll plug that in there, just so that they now sync up temporarily, just only updating this when the boss is spawned in. which means that we shouldn't be entering this check before we start the game, and also we won't be spawning in more than one boss at a time. And then quite simply we can actually just copy this down, so we'll get another spawn actor from class, and all we want to do is change the class to be BP underscore enemy 2. So we won't see this happening for a little while, just because we don't have collision or anything or death states or anything set up. But what we can see hopefully is at the 000 point, we should be seeing some enemy 1s spawned in at least. Okay, so it's kind of happening. Yeah, it's kind of happening off screen, but we can see all of the enemy 1s every so many seconds based on the random float value that we set up. They're being spawned in at 000, and then they are all just moving left for some reason. So, oh no, they are moving right as well, so that's perfect. So we have the logic is kind of working. As I said, the idea of this is really just to get things to start happening, and we'll flesh and update this as we go through. But what we do know is that things are definitely spawning in, so we know that when this logic is met later, then this event or this function should work too. And all that really leaves us is to create the asteroid and to spawn that in. And for anyone who's interested, all we're going to be doing is off of the then one, we're going to call another set timer by function name, and we're just going to set up some very similar logic there too. And to finish this off, as I said, we're just going to create a nice little function to get a random location within our component bound, which is why we're using a trigger. I didn't mention that before, but what we have here is a box that we can change the extents of. So we're going to drag this into the world, and we'll spawn something within the bounds, or we'll spawn the enemies within the bounds of this box. Okay, so once again, kind of going on longer than I wanted for a single video, so I will leave that one here today. Hopefully this has been useful. If it has, then please do like and share the video. That's really going to help. To be kept up to date with the latest content, then do subscribe to the channel. And I just wanted to give another thank you to the current supporters of the channel via Patreon, so thank you again for your continued support. And likewise, if you'd considered supporting the channel yourself and you haven't yet, then do have a look at the Patreon page. As ever though, thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.